I'm happy to be able to introduce Anthony Flaccavento this morning. When I first moved to this area in 2001, I consider it one of the good fortunes in my life that I came to work with Appalachian Sustainable Development and to really be inspired by Anthony and what all that he's been doing here. Anthony is currently has a consulting business scale as well as a farming venture, and I'm sure he'll tell us more about, well, welcome Anthony, thank you.
Well, I'm glad to be here with all of you, and I'm talking this morning. The title kind of comes from a Huffington Post piece I did a little while ago last fall called WTF Politics, and that's kind of the beginning point for this talk. I'm gonna use a lot of readings in different places throughout this. I also brought sort of a small portion of my current library, which, as like some of you have heard me say, my son Josh 15 years ago said, "Dad only reads things that add to his sense of moral outrage." So knowing that, which is basically 100% accurate, there's a really good library around economics, politics, and media back there, just a little snippet of it. One of my new favorite books by Robert McChesney. When we tune out politics, when we abandon hope, we aren't being cool or hip or ironic or even realistic. We are being played. So when Lori and I were in Italy and I was working on this book, we were in Sicily, and at that time there was yet another battle over the continuing resolution to fund the government. And eventually a so-called budget compromise was signed, which President Obama pushed for vigorously. And that budget compromise, among many other things, contained the following 4 provisions. Number 1, derivatives, which are those sneaky faux wealth new financial mechanisms that have made trillions of dollars on Wall Street in non-real financial wealth, which were finally regulated somewhat under the Dodd-Frank bill. This budget compromise removed that regulation and instead allowed Wall Street investment firms to once again trade in derivatives backed by the U.S. taxpayer. So now they are right back at that with, in fact, our backing if they go bad. Second thing was around family farmers. For years, well over a decade, small contract poultry and pig growers, who are the vast majority, not our wonderful grass-based folks we have here, but the majority, had been fighting this essentially feudal arrangement of their relationship to the big corporate meat processors, Tyson and IBP and whatnot. And after literally 10 years of fighting, in 2011, I believe it was, they finally got a rule, an administrative rule within USDA that more or less leveled the playing field, that allowed somebody raising contract poultry. And I know one in Arkansas, and by the way, they get paid 7 cents a pound for their chickens, for chickens that we spend far more than that. They finally had a little leg to stand on if they had a contract dispute with Tyson or one of the others, which they'd never had before. This budget compromise completely prohibited and defunded USDA from being able to enforce those rules. So those small contract farmers were once again completely at the mercy of the big agri-giants. The third thing they did was pension funds. We hear a lot about pension funds, and so many pension funds are heavy on liabilities and short on assets. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but much of it has to do with really bad investments on the part of Wall Street advisors. Rather than going after the Wall Street advisors, what this budget compromise did was it put into federal law that it is now legal for states to renege on whatever portion of the promises they made to their public pensioners, their firefighters and school teachers and whatnot. if that's what they feel they need to do in order to bring their pension funds back into balance. Not renege on their bank obligations, but on the pensioners themselves. And the last and perhaps most extraordinary thing in this, not the last one, but the last I'm going to cite, is the fact that in this budget compromise legislation was also a provision that tripled the legal amount that the wealthy can give to political campaigns. Now, this is totally separate from Citizens United and the phenomenal flow of dark money, so-called Koch brothers money. But it said, for that little piece of public financing that's still regulated, the maximum you can give to a candidate in a cycle, they tripled it. In a time when we all know that there's already far, far, far too much influence of money in politics. So when I read that and saw that the Republicans signed on, and our Democratic president and many Democratic senators also signed on, I said, this is WTF politics. And when I said that in the Huffington Post piece, I was talking about WTF in the conventional sense that young folks use the words, where you get a little email about something that's just absolutely mind-boggling and you say, WTF, or you say it out. But I was also saying it in something that's more fundamental and lasting, which is we're at a place, politically and economically, where wealth trumps fairness, always. Wealth trumps fairness. And while I'd be the first to argue that there are substantial differences in our two reigning political parties on many important issues, immigration, gay rights, many things, even some economic issues, the fact of the matter is that both major parties are now beholden to this. It's WTF politics, it's wealth trumps fairness. So what I'm going to do in the time we have is I'm going to first talk about just how bad it is. And this will be the abbreviated version, so I'll only go to about 4:30 on that. But then I'm going to talk a little bit about what can we do. And the what can we do will be some of the kind of local things that many of you are already engaged with, but maybe some bigger things. So I'm going to sort of run through. But I think it's although we all know it's bad, and I don't want to dwell on it too much, but I think it's really important. So besides that budget compromise, that was just sort of emblematic. How bad is it? Well, we know the extraordinary concentration of wealth. We know that the Walton family, the heirs to the Walton family, that single family now have slightly more total financial assets than the 100 million bottom Americans, which is to say poor people, working folks, even into the lower middle class. One family has more financial assets than 100 million Americans. Globally, it's not much difference. There's talk now about that there's somewhere on the order of 80 families that control about half of the world's assets. It's a level of wealth concentration that at this point is going beyond even where we were before the 1929 stock market crash. That concentration of wealth, as people like Richard Wilkinson has made very clear in his book, The Spirit Level, it's not only like just so unbelievably unfair, but it has clear, demonstrably bad consequences in every way that would matter to most people. Inequality within societies, across societies, within states, and even within local communities, inequality, the extent of inequality is so closely correlated with poor health, from infant mortality and maternal health right through to how the elderly. It's very closely correlated with higher rates of crime and higher rates of incarceration. It's very closely, tightly correlated with poor academic performance. On and on and on, from our health, from our education, and fundamentally, it's also very tightly associated with cynicism, okay? So inequality isn't just unfair, it's bad for everybody except the very, very top, not even the 1%, but the 1/10 of 1%. It's bad for everybody. And we have this phenomenal level of inequality. And of course, with that inequality, economically has gone, because of not just Citizens United, but generations of bad decisions by federal courts and Supreme Court. So Citizens United and the current Supreme Court, which is the worst in my lifetime for sure. But when you really read back on it, and I did a little reading on this for when I was running, it's actually Citizens United is just the latest and the worst. But it's a culmination, it's not an aberration. It's the way things have been moving for a long time. And essentially, as we all know, Citizens United made it clear what had been almost clear before, which was that corporations now have personhood in all the sense that means. But also that it probably even more profoundly disturbing is the equation of money with free speech in a sort of one-for-one fashion is the way they described it in the ruling. So that unlimited expenditure of money is considered by this court and now the law of the land to be equal to unlimited speech. The more you spend, the more you're expressing your free will of speech. That, of course, is so fundamentally absurd, so completely illogical by any sort of definition of what it means to speak freely. It's 180 degrees from that, but that's where we're at. So that has led then to the fact that, as Martin Gillen's just in a recent piece noted, the wishes of ordinary citizens actually don't matter anymore. So Bernie Sanders was on Tavis Smiley as Lori and I were driving up, and he was talking about the great outrages, and he was saying the big question is, can we motivate the grassroots when so many people are so demoralized? And that is the big question. And people are demoralized for a good reason, for bad and declining economic fortunes first and foremost, but also because a lot of people have a sense that how they vote and what priorities they express to their legislators at particularly the federal level, but state levels increasingly, simply don't matter. And for years, when I heard people say that, I'd say, no, it does matter. Actually, now we have the numbers. It doesn't. It doesn't. What you and I think, what our priorities are, is so completely divergent from the decisions that are made. And the Gillen study looked at 1,800 different public policy decisions over a period of, I think it was about 6 or 8 years. And there's essentially no connection between what average citizens hold as priorities and the policies that are adopted. None. Where the correlation is between the wishes of the very wealthy and big business interests. Even the public advocacy groups that we think about that are advocating, let's say again, for some liberal social causes or whatnot, they sometimes win, but they only win when their interests happen to align with the wealthy elite, which on some social issues they do. Like, for instance, gay marriage. There's some correlation there between what the very wealthy want and what some liberal interest groups want. But it's completely dominated. So the fact of the matter is now that we have phenomenal economic inequality, which is creating really bad economic outcomes in lives for many, many people. And then on top of that, a political system that is, it's fair to say, literally completely beholden to the wealthy. We also know that at the local level, when economies are dominated by one or two big interests, or let's say a few big interests, the outcomes are far worse than when you have a diverse economic base. And again, there's been several really excellent studies from Cornell and other places that have looked at this. Comparing county side by side, those that have 1 to 3 major employers as the dominant interest, big employers, versus those that have multiple businesses as part of their economic base. And again, across the board, the things that would matter to us, from health and wellness to the way we care for the poor to incarceration rates to education levels, across the board, it's much, much worse when it's got economic concentration at the local level. Now, the flip of that is part of what I'm going to talk about when I get to the good news, is that the good news is that diverse, vibrant local economies do have actually better communities. We know that. It's not just a matter of some romantic notion of mom and pop. It's the fact of the matter. They create more vibrancy, and they create people who are more civically engaged, more interested in doing something beyond that. So we've got all those factors, and then we've got maybe one more thing I would talk about, which is the rise of kind of despair, and with despair, this outraged speech. One of the books back there is by Thomas Frank, who's written a number of really good books, including What's the Matter with Kansas. But he, in his most recent book, Pity the Billionaire, he does a very interesting look at how exactly did we get to this place where, as so many of us have said, why do people vote against their own interests? It just doesn't make sense. And what he's done and what, in What's the Matter with White People, which is another absolutely outstanding book by Joan Walsh, is looking at basically the betrayal of working class people. And Joan Walsh's book, What's the Matter with White People, looks at that over the course of basically from Nixon to the present, and makes it very clear that what's happened is that as the economy was changing And as Nixon went after unions, and then Reagan even more went after unions, simultaneously to deliberately and directly fighting the interests of working people, they sort of perfected scapegoating. They kind of reinvigorated and perfected scapegoating. So they said, your problems have nothing to do with these policies where we're cutting the taxes on the wealthy and redistributing up. It has to do with women entering the workplace. It has to do with blacks. It has to do with welfare queens. It has to do with all of that. So there was this sort of very deliberate, simultaneous connection between those two. And as a result, we have most working people who fled the Democratic Party and gone over to the Republican side. But what Thomas Frank says is it's not just about the bad things the Republicans did. It's the fact that the Democrats, theoretically the working people's party, completely let it happen, completely. And with some obviously notable exceptions. We can all think of Elizabeth Warren and some other fine folks, but basically the Democrats have been complicit. And he looks specifically at the period right around 2009, before Occupy Wall Street, when Obama was coming into office, when TARP was being written. And he says almost everything about that was like 1929, 1930, 1932, and the sort of what led up to FDR and led up to the phenomenal flood of pro-person, pro-worker legislation that we think of as the New Deal. He calls it hard time politics. And he says the great irony is that we had the basis for it. We had people fed up, disgusted with bankers who were getting these big golden parachutes while ordinary people were suffering. They were disgusted with the bailout. And essentially, he says what happened is the liberal side of the political party completely missed that opportunity and allowed the right wing, the rightist of the right wing, to define what the problem was. And so very quickly they shifted it from a focus on big business and Wall Street to big government. And that's been enduring, maybe beginning to crack a little now, but that's been the enduring debate of the Obama years, is the focus on big government as the source of all our problems. He points to Rick Santelli. He was the guy who essentially launched the Tea Party. I can't tell you in reading all these books just how hard it is to be an Italian American. I swear, Rudy Giuliani, Rick Santelli, there's just so many right-wingers. It's just frickin' depressing. But Rick Santelli was this reporter for CNBC who often reported from the floor of the stock exchange. And it was him that morning who went into this epic rant that then became viral across the internet, in which he was screaming about TARP. But the thing that he was screaming about was not all the hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars going to the big banks, which is where practically all of the money went in the TARP program. He was screaming about one small part of it that was included that was supposed to be debt relief and renegotiation for mortgage holders. In other words, ordinary people who were suddenly finding their homes of much lower value and facing bankruptcy. There was a tiny slice of TARP that was intended to go to them and for the banks to work with them to renegotiate their loans so that they could stay in their homes. It was a fraction. It was a fraction of it. It actually never happened. But at that time, it was in the legislation that was passed. And he went ballistic about that and screamed things about all these hardworking people here on the floor. Do you want to be paying for somebody else's home, some loser who couldn't make their payment? Do you want to pay for their house that's too big for their income, for their second bathroom? Do you want to do this? This was his rant that launched the Tea Party. And what he effectively did was he equated Wall Street traders who make more in a day than most of us make in a year as hard-working guys who were getting screwed by these lazy do-nothings, these takers, as the Republicans started calling them. So really quite extraordinary. So you've got all of these things from economic concentration, political concentration, media consolidation, which has also gone afoot, and then this public debate. And then the last part of the bad news, I'll say, is climate change. And I'm about 2/3 of the way through Naomi Klein's most recent book, This Changes Everything. And so this is where I'm going to make like the transition from how bad it is to what's possible. Because Naomi Klein, along with people like Jim Hightower and some others, is one of those people who thinks that maybe enough really bad things for enough ordinary people are converging at once, that this may be the moment, if we go about it right, if we do it differently from the way we've been doing things for the last little bit, that we can mobilize a far, far broader and more comprehensive movement towards real social change and social justice. So, because climate change is, of course, at an extraordinarily difficult place. So let me just read a little tiny excerpt from what she says about that. She's referring here to Occupy. She's referring to the movements, the Arab Spring, a lot of these social movements in this context. Many of us are getting a lot better at standing up to those who would cynically exploit crises to ransackle the public sphere. And yet these protests have also shown that saying no is not enough. If opposition movements are to do more than burn bright and burn out, they will need a comprehensive vision for what should emerge in the place of our failing system, as well as serious political strategies for how to achieve these goals. They'll need a worldview will need to rise to the fore that sees nature, other nations, and our own neighbors not as adversaries, but as partners in a grand project of mutual reinvention. So what Naomi Klein is talking about is something that isn't just a return to the New Deal state, which would certainly be preferable to where we are, but that recognizes that some of what we were able to do in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s was because there was a whole lot less people on an essentially bigger planet. And that now, with China and India becoming manic American-style consumers, we need to not only deal with social injustice and political inequality, but we need to do it in a frame that is really recognizing that the earth has limits. And so that's where she talks about this grand, I love that phrase, this grand project of mutual reinvention. So, what can we do? What is there to be hopeful about? Well, first of all, again, we know that the local food movement, which is the biggest, most developed part of the local economy movement, which I tend to refer to more broadly, that it has made big differences in a lot of places. It's made differences for farmers, for consumers. The local economy movement is alive and well in many, many parts of this country. It's not just a phenomenon in the Abingdon area. It's happening in New Mexico. It's happening in rural and big cities all over the country. It really is. And that with that local economy movement goes, not just more economic opportunity, because a diversity of businesses create more jobs than one big business. They create better wages. They do a lot of things. But it's also starting to re-energize communities. So first of all, I'd say that one thing we can all do in whatever way we can do it, both with our dollars, but also with our letters and our advocacy, is to take this local economy, what some folks call the local living economy movement, and build it up with everything we've got. Because it's in those things that we have, generally speaking, more ecologically friendly, more humane types of businesses and enterprises that build communities that are more resilient and able to care for themselves with fewer needs, including fossil fuels. So we need to really be taking the work that's kind of been the foundation that many of us in this room have focused on for the last 30 years or so, and build it up much more. It needs to become part of that vision that Naomi Klein says we have to have. It can't just be in opposition. And this local living economy movement, what I call the bottom-up economy, is a substantial, it's not the only part, but it's a substantial part of what that vision of a better world could be, all right? And it's a good thing to do in the meantime. It brings interest and vibrancy and diversity to local communities. So that's one thing, build on them. But we also have to recognize, and for many of us who focus most of our lives on trying to do the local thing, we have to recognize that it's just not enough. As Robert McChesney says, I've encountered a lot of people, especially unfortunately some of the brightest, most delightful young people that I met on my campaign, who for the most part have essentially given up. They've opted out. Politics is uncool. Politics is a black hole. Politics is disgusting. And in that opting out and focusing all of our energies on building local, we have built better local communities. But for every yard of progress we've made building local economies, we've lost a mile in terms of public policy and the public debate. We've just gotten our butts kicked over and over again, and we can't do that anymore. So the local economy, the living economy, the sustainability movement that's been primarily focused on local is a foundation to build on. It's something we can and should accelerate and strengthen, but it's only a foundation. It's not sufficient by itself. We need broader, longer-term change, and there's a lot of interesting folks, and I hope you will at least glance at some of those books about that. Again, Naomi Klein is beginning to outline some of a vision of what this might be. Jim Hightower, in his wonderful ranting little newsletters that he sends out, is talking about the emergence of even Tea Party type libertarian interests of people who are really, really frustrated with things, with people on the left of the spectrum coming in. A fellow named Gar Alperovitz, who's an economist with the Democracy Collaborative, he talks about a real deliberate strategy that recognizes that we'll never have the conditions of the New Deal again. We'll never have the conditions of right after post-World War II, that we live in a different world. There's some things we did back then that we can do, but we need a new strategy, and Alperovitz refers to it as a checkerboard strategy. That if we think of the world and all of its problems and opportunities as a checkerboard, we can see that certain squares are blocked. And what we need to do is start finding where those openings are. And he outlines this in his book, What Now Must We Do? That those are the squares where we need to move. We need to move aggressively, and we need to move really, really long term, is trying to find the openings that we have in order to create this new economy and this new world. And then I think we need to be cheered by, again, in doing the research for my book, it was just so exciting to see what's happening. Just that, a lot of us know some of the cool things happening here. Here's some other things happening. In New Hampshire, a local nonprofit group worked with a fairly progressive local bank, and they were dealing with a trailer park, a manufactured home housing park, a trailer park in rural New Hampshire that was about to be sold. The ground, like most trailer parks, people own their trailers. The ground underneath was somebody else's. And the guy who owned that ground decided he wanted to liquidate it. He thought he could get some development in. And so when he was about to sell it, these two groups converged. They convinced the bank to, in fact, loan money to the group. It was like 100 different trailers in this park. They bought the ground underneath of their feet rather than it being sold off. And then subsequently, the improvements to the home, the sort of civic spirit, the yards, the vitality, that it's become a real neighborhood. So rather than that, and that then became that one little inkling of just, sell off the land, move your damn trailer somewhere else, has not only become a vibrant community, it's become a permanent part of this bank's loan portfolio. They actually have a manufactured home park loan portfolio now where they're doing this in many places, taking people who are among the most left out and building their assets. In Buffalo, there's a group called Push Buffalo that has done a lot of different things, from community gardens to public parks. But fundamentally what they did is it was in one of the poorest neighborhoods in Buffalo, and they decided to create a green development zone. But to do that, the first thing they had to grapple with was the fact that most of the homes, or not most, but hundreds of homes in that neighborhood, some were being lived in and some were vacant, many of them were vacant, were owned by the New York State Housing Agency. And what had the New York State Housing Agency done with these properties that they owned in the middle of Buffalo in a poor neighborhood? They had packaged them into a Wall Street financial instrument that was then sold. It was like a derivative, like a credit default swap. It was then sold. It was packaged as a group of mortgages in default. They sold it. And so the state of New York was literally drawing revenue. Its housing agency was drawing revenue from keeping these lots vacant and watching them decline. And so Push challenged that. They went to bat, and they not only got that overturned and freed up all the money for Buffalo, but it was a statewide change in policy. And so now the state housing agency no longer has these kinds of financial instruments on Wall Street. And in fact, they're taking the money and using it now to reinvest. And then Push took that, and they trained low-income people in green housing and rehabilitation and energy retrofits. And now they've got this vibrant, what they call high road economic sector in one of the poorest parts of Buffalo, where people are being put to work to do this. One more I'm going to mention. In Vallejo, California, it's one of, right now, about 30 communities in the United States that 3 years ago started doing something called participatory budgeting. And I've talked to Ed Morgan about maybe whether we could bring this to Abington. Here's what participatory budgeting is. They started it in Brazil. You take a pot of money from, it's usually the local government, it could be the city, the county, it can be a borough or a district, it could be even a school system. But you somehow manage to get the elected officials who normally make decisions about money to agree that a certain portion of the budget they're going to turn over to a citizens' participatory budgeting process, not for advice, but for their decisions. And Vallejo, California, which was a poor community in bankruptcy in 2010, took that step. They were the first one in the country. Now it's been done in part of Chicago, in New York City, in several places. It's growing pretty rapidly. And so citizens come together for months to develop ideas of what they would do. Now, typically it's a tiny little slice. Like in New York City right now, it's grown and it's about $30 million. Well, New York City has a $25 billion budget or something like that. So it's not like a lot of money, but what it's done in Vallejo, New York, and other places is got citizens engaged. They've come together, they've decided this is what our community needs. It's fixing the lights on the roads, it's building playgrounds for the kids, it's a community park, it's whatever it is. They rank the priorities, they work with the staff to develop them, figure out what they would cost, what the best thing is, and ultimately the citizens vote, and it's their decision. Again, it's not advisory. A very small but a really radical step towards re-engaging people with democracy. So the thing is, we're at this place that is simultaneously so bad. It is so depressing for people who've, if you're like me and you've spent a few years trying to make the world better, it's really sobering. But at the same time, there's this emergence of economic and political and civic things happening all around this country and the world that's really quite amazing. And if we could just tap it and magnify it, it would really add up to something and perhaps be transformative. So I'm going to close, and then I'm hoping there's a few minutes for a conversation. I'm going to close with three other little things here that kind of frame for me. Marjorie Kelly wrote the book, Owning Our Future. Now I'm going to skip that. That's a great one, but I'm not going to do it. Wendell Berry. Of course, I always have to read Wendell. In his book, Citizenship Papers, which he wrote after 9/11, he says this: "My hope is most seriously challenged by the fact of decline, of loss. The things that I have tried to defend are less numerous and worse off now than when I started. But in this, I am only like all other conservationists. All of us have been fighting a battle that on average we are losing. The point, the only interesting point, is that we have not quit. Ours is not a fight that you can stay in very long if you look on victory as a sign of triumph or on loss as a sign of defeat. We have not quit because we are not hopeless. My own aim is not hopelessness. I'm not looking for reasons to give up. I'm looking for reasons to keep on." And Robert McChesney, in terms of how do we mobilize people, Bernie Sanders' question, he says this: "In this political economic environment, it's imperative that activists of all stripes speak boldly and truthfully about the problems of our times and the need for radical change. If activists assume that radical change is impossible and deem it unmentionable, not because it's wrong, but because the entrenched forces are so powerful that to challenge them might undermine their legitimacy, by our very actions we increase the likelihood that it will be impossible. We need to capture the imaginations of people such that they believe politics can lead to radical improvements in their lives and the lives of those they know and love." And then the last thing, early in February, just the week I was finishing the book, this young woman, Kayla Jean Mueller, was killed in Syria. She was the young woman that was killed possibly in a NATO bombing attack or possibly by her captors. We don't know. A year earlier, she had given an interview to her local paper. I think it was in Arizona or maybe Oklahoma. She was 25 years old, and at the time she was working in Syria. I don't know if I'll even be able to get this out. She said, "For as long as I live, I will not let the suffering be normal. It's important to realize what we have, why we have it, and how privileged we are. And from that place, start caring and get a lot done." And that's a 25-year-old woman saying that. And so when I think about those things, Wendell's view that the important thing is that we haven't quit, McChesney's point that we need to be bold in our vision for a new politics, not be so incremental, not be so wishy-washy, and then the unbelievable courage of a person like that. That's why I don't give up, and that's why I think we really can be part of something that's different, something that's just not just getting us back, but getting us to a place that's better. Thanks.